Okay, so I'm going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. Okay, so this session is on processes of data sharing. And the people you'll be hearing from include, first of all, Russ Poldrack. So Russ had his bachelor's degree from Baylor University back in '89. He got his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he was working with Neil Cohen. He then was a postdoc at Stanford working with John Gabrielli, and he's held faculty positions at Harvard Medical School and the University of Texas at Austin, and he's now the Albert Ray Lang Professor of Psychology at Stanford University. You're also going to be hearing from Maryam Vaziri Pashkam. She has a medical degree from Tehran Medical University, a PhD in cognitive psychology from Harvard, and she's currently a research fellow at the Laboratory of Brain and Cognition at the National Institute of Mental Health. The main theme of her research is to understand vision and action. Using behavioral experiments in naturalistic settings, body movement tracking, and functional MRI, she explores the processes of visual information during natural interactions. And myself, I'm an associate professor of psychology at Penn State. And my primary area of interest is in understanding visual representations, so how the brain builds mental representations of things. So before I turn the stage over to Russ, what I'm going to do is just give you a very brief introduction into a variety of aspects of open science. And Russ is going to talk about one very specific aspect. So over the past 10, 15 years, there's been an explosion in interest in ways that we can make science more open. And there are four main pillars of these open science practices. The first of which is sharing of preprints, which allow us to speed up the time scale of innovation when publishing is slow, because we can read papers as they're still being reviewed. We've also developed a lot of ways of open access publication, which means that after papers have been published, they're accessible for everyone. We're also developing new ways of sharing data freely so that anyone can download and analyze existing data. And finally, the focus of today's session, this current session, is on developing good standards for sharing of data. Now, I want to also point out that after this session is over, there's going to be another professional development session on open science practices. So you'll hear more about these other aspects there. So just to tell you briefly about preprints, there are a number of preprint servers that you can use to publish copies of your paper while it's still being edited or even reviewed by a journal. So for example, Archive is hosted by Cornell University, and it was sort of the first large one of these, and it's primarily for physics and engineering applications. BioArchive is a version of this for neuroscience and biology, and SciArchive is a version of this for those of us in the psychological sciences. So in these servers, you can upload a copy of your paper while it's being edited or reviewed, and anyone can download it while the review process is ongoing. And you know, journals are generally okay with this process, but you should check the journal's policy before you upload to one of these servers. Now, open access publications is another way in which open science has developed recently. So, you know, the sort of legacy model of scientific publication is that authors get to publish for free, and then readers are required to pay. And the reader in this case is often typically the university library, which has to pay a variety of fees. And then, so what we also have are new mechanisms of open new mechanisms of open access publications, which require authors to pay up front to publish, and then they can make that content freely available. And there's a lot of open access journals that have become available. And finally, I want to talk briefly about open data. This is essentially the process of putting your data available for free on a server, which allows anyone to download it. You can do this in any way that you want. You can put it on your own personal website, but it is strongly encouraged that folks use archival grade storage mechanisms. So for example, the Center for Open Science, which you'll be hearing about in the very next session, has created something called the Open Science Framework. And this is a way in which you can, for free, upload your data to a repository. You don't have to pay literally anything. It's 100% free, and they will store it, and you can use that as a platform to distribute the data sets from any of your papers. Now, the fourth of these pillars, which I had mentioned, is developing good standards for sharing of data. And that's what Russ is going to tell us about. It's, one thing to share data, but it's another thing to share data in a way that other people can understand the data sets. And so if we build good standards for sharing very complex data, such as especially fMRI, it becomes a lot easier for people to communicate these data. Now, as many of you are familiar with by now, there is an Ask a Question feature of Crowdcast. So what I would like to do is encourage people to ask questions. And at the end of this talk, if you would like to come up on stage and ask your question in person, please type something like +on-stage at the end of your question, and then we'll know that you'd like to come up on stage. Otherwise, we'll ask the question ourselves. So with that, I'm going to turn the platform over to Russ. You can go ahead and share your screen now.
All right. Let me see if this gives us what we want. Are you seeing my slides or my presenter view?
This is presenter view.
Oh, okay, sorry. I need to share the other screen.
Crowdcast is still a pretty young platform. They're filing off a few rough edges, but we're getting there.
How's that?
That looks great.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks very much for the intro, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm excited to talk about what we've been working on for quite a while now around how to share data and how to try to share it well. And so the work that I'm going to talk about comes out of a number of people's contributions who are either part of or collaborate with the center that we have called the Center for Reproducible Neuroscience. And I think of our work as being, centered around a number of different foci. One is open data, and that's what I'm going to focus on mostly today, particularly on the Open Neuro platform. And sort of fundamental to that is, I'm not really going to say much about open tools. Fundamental to that is open standards. So the idea that if we're going to share data well, then we need to have sort of agreed upon standards for how those data are going to be organized. We also do some work on meta science, as in the recent NARP study. I'm not really going to talk about that today either. So I'm really going to focus on open data and open standards. And first, I just want to highlight the fact that there's many good reasons that everyone should share their data whenever possible. The first is that we have a responsibility to our participants. So, people often focus on kind of the risk side of human subject participation, but the regulations for human subject research and similarly for animal research, say that we have a positive obligation as researchers to maximize the benefits of those subjects' participation. And whenever we hoard our data and refuse to share them, we're almost necessarily failing to maximize the contribution of those participants. We also have a responsibility to taxpayers who are paying for most of our research. If we're collecting new data when we don't need to, when we could be reusing existing data, then we're probably wasting money. I think one of the most important reasons is that we know that we all make errors, and transparency helps us correct them. So this is just one example, actually a pretty consequential error. This was a paper published in 2010 by Reinhardt and Rogoff, which was really one of the kind of supporting pillars of this austerity agenda that came about in Europe and the US after the financial crisis around 2010. It turns out that they made a mistake in their Excel spreadsheet, and they happened to leave out Belgium, which was a key counterexample to their claim. And once you include Belgium, their claim no longer holds up. And so, had that not been shared, had that spreadsheet not been shared, nobody would have been able to figure that out. So, unfortunately, simply sharing the data is not enough. They need to be shared in a way that's useful. And I'm not going to play this video, but I would suggest that you go search for this data sharing and management snafu in 3 short acts, which is one of these kind of animated videos. It's pretty funny. It's about a person trying to get some data from someone else for a paper related to a paper that was published in Science. So these are just a couple of quotes. I received the data, but when I opened it, it was in hexadecimal. The person who shares the data says, yes, that's right. I cannot read hexadecimal. You asked for my data and I gave it to you. I've done what you asked, right? And then later, is there a guide to the data anywhere? Yes, of course. It's in the article that was published in Science. And unfortunately, too many data sharing experiences end up going a little bit like that. And so, what we need to do in order to make the data usable for others is, one, to organize them in an understandable way. And that includes both the data and the metadata, the associated data that one needs in order to be able to actually understand and use a shared data set. So we began working on this about 5 years ago in the brain imaging community. We've been sharing data for substantially longer than that, but we never really had a community standard for how those data should be organized. And so we worked with people from a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different software developers, to basically come up with an open standard for neuroscience data, but really focused initially on neuroimaging. And it really it's called the Brain Imaging Data Structure, BIDS. You can find more info at bids.neuroimaging.io. And you can really think of it as having two parts. One is a standard for how files should be organized, and another is a standard for how the metadata should be organized. So when we get data off of a scanner, it looks something like what you see on the left. It's in a format that nobody really likes, called DICOM, in part because it's not really human understandable. And so what people in most labs do is they format the data into something like what you see on the right. And this is actually the format of a BIDS data set. So we built a standard around what a lot of people already did in their labs. So the idea is you have a data set, it's broken into data from different subjects. It has some various files with information about all the subjects. It has some images for each subject. But the idea is that you can look at that and pretty quickly kind of understand what's there. We use kind of standard file formats for the imaging domain. So all the imaging files are stored in a format called NIfTY, which is a pretty common, almost universal standard in the brain imaging field. We try to, for whatever data we can, we use simple tab delimited text files. Now, some of the data are a little bit more complex, and we need to be able to store things that are a little more structured. And so there we use JSON, which is another relatively common and relatively human readable format. So there's two things that the BIDS standard says about files. One is it gives you basically a template for how to name directories. So this is an example, you'd say subject, participant label, session with a session label, whatever the data type is, like in this case, an anatomical image. So it gives you a template for how directories should be named, and then a template for how files should be named. And you've got some things you have to have, like the subject and the modality label, and then there's other things that are optional that one can include, and they'll allow you to encode a decent bit of information into the file name, which a lot of people in our field like to do. Now, a standard isn't really very useful if a person can't tell whether their data actually meet the standard. And particularly for us, one of the main reasons that we started building the standard was we wanted to be able to ingest data automatically for the Open Neuro project that I'm going to tell you about. Having spent several years before that working with individual people who wanted to share their data, trying to reformat them by hand, that just wasn't a scalable process. And so another thing that we did was to build a validator. This is it's actually a piece of JavaScript, which is nice because that means it can run in the browser. So, and you'll see an example when I walk through Open Neuro later, how you can basically, you can point it at a data set, and without ever uploading it, it can look at it on the computer and tell you basically whether that data set meets the BIDS standard or not. And if it doesn't, it gives you some warnings to try to tell you basically how to fix the problems. Now, BIDS was really started by Chris Gorgolewski, who was the co-director of the center at Stanford until he moved to Google in 2019. So there was a little bit of a crisis after that because, whenever the kind of founder of a project leaves, nobody knows what's going to happen. But the community really came together and decided, we need to make this a joint community project. And so we last year had an election to elect a steering group, and I'm part of that steering group. And you see, it's a really broad group, people focused on many different types of data, people from, largely from Europe. And so that, this group now is responsible for kind of decision making at the very top. But then there's a lot of people, doing work on the standard itself. Now, we started out really focusing on raw data, on raw, functional and structural MRI data, but we soon realized that we were going to need to extend the standard. And so we put together a process for basically proposing extensions, which is based very closely on the way that things work on web standards with W3C. So we already have a number of extensions to different raw data modalities, including MEG, EEG, intracranial EEG. PET is coming soon. Different types of MRI are coming soon. We have standards for genetic information and eye tracking. And we also have what we call a derivative data standard. The idea there is, we want to be able to describe not just raw data, but also data that had been processed. And so we're working now, that's challenging, because they can be processed in many ways. We're working now on standards for more modality specific types of derivatives. So I want to tell you about the Open Neuro project, which is a project that we run that's focused on sharing a broad range of neuroimaging data. Basically, any type of data for which there's a bid standard, you can share on Open Neuro. And we currently have almost 400 public data sets, more than 11,000 subjects worth of data. And you can find this at openneuro.org. So I'm just going to show you what it looks like. If you go to openneuro.org, you don't even have to log in to see the public data sets. So if you go to this public dashboard up top, you'll see these public data sets. I'm sorting here by the number of stars that have been given to each data set. We get a bunch of statistics over here about the different data sets. And so let's say we want to look at this LA5C study data set. We can go to that page and you see that it has a number of different versions. We're going to look at the most recent version. Whenever you upload a data set, you have to create a snapshot. And this is an immutable version of the data. If you change something, add additional data or modify some data, you'll have to create a new snapshot. And one nice thing is that means that you know exactly what data went into any analysis if you know what snapshot was used, what version was used. So if you want to download the data, you just click on the download button. You can download it in your browser. There's also other ways to download it using S3, using our command line client, or using DataLed. So lots of different avenues to the data. And I should mention that the data, these data are part of the Amazon Public Datasets project. So they actually provide us with free hosting for all of the public data. Each data set is given a digital object identifier, or a DOI, and this is something that a lot of journals want. If you're going to share a data set, they want to know that it's in a place that has a permanent, unique identifier. And so, for example, if you're going to write a paper for a journal like Scientific Data to describe your data set, they're going to want you to give a DOI for that data set, and Open Neuro gives you one of those, a separate one for every version of the data. We also have a license associated with the data. So anytime you share data, you need to be clear about exactly what the license is under which you are providing those data to people, so they know what rights they have for using them. I think we're kind of at the end of the distribution here in being pretty radically open in the way that we share data. We share data according to what's called a CC0, or a public domain dedication, which basically means the data are put out into the world with absolutely no restrictions on what can be done with them. Minimal intellectual property restrictions, no requirements for any sort of co-authorship or any restraint on what you can do with them. Now, obviously, we need to make sure that we're not endangering our subjects. In particular, we want to first make sure that they know what they're getting into. And so there's a project called Open Brain Consent that's developed a set of basically like recommended consent language for human subjects to make sure that subjects understand the potential risk of their data being shared openly and the potential benefits. We also, obviously need to remove any identifying information. And with regard to MRI images of the head, we have to worry about facial structure, because we know that you can reconstruct a face and potentially identify it from these images. So we provide a defacing tool. There's a bunch of other tools out there as well. And all of the data that get uploaded need to be de-identified. If you want to look at a particular image, you can go, let's say you want to look at this image down here. There's a in-browser image viewer, so you just click view and that image will come up. You can poke around, you can download it. And similarly for text files, you can view them on the site. If you have a question about a data set, or if you're a data set owner and somebody has a question for you, there's a comment section at the bottom of each data set. And anytime a comment gets put up, the owner of the data set gets notified so that they can see that somebody has a question or a comment. And so this allows users to quickly get back in touch with the owner of the data. You'll also notice a button up here that's highlighted that says Analyze on brainlife.io. So another thing that we are working now to do is to try to basically make the data more available for processing. And so BrainLife is a project run by Franco Pastilli from University of Texas at Austin, which basically provides cloud-based data analysis using a number of different workflows. And so what you can do is basically you click that button, it takes you to BrainLife, and then you just click the import button, and then the data will be imported. And then there's a bunch of different pipelines. So for example, you want to run FreeSurfer, you just click on the FreeSurfer app, it'll have you configure it, and then you can run FreeSurfer on your data using cloud computing resources that you don't have to pay for. So what if you want to upload a data set? Basically, you have to log in. You can log in using your Google or Orchid credentials. You click on upload. The first thing it's going to do is tell you to choose a folder and tell you to make sure that there's no faces on any of the images. And so you choose your folder, it runs the BIDS validation. It says that we found some warnings, you're not required to fix them. That's fine, we'll just continue. You're asked to put in various metadata, and you can always go and put this in later, and we're working on improving the metadata that's collected here. And finally, you have to accept the terms of the sharing. And the first is that you own the data set, you have the right permissions to share the data. There's no identifiable information in the data. You also agree that the data are going to become publicly available. If you don't make them public available, they're going to automatically become publicly available 36 months after the first snapshot. And we also ask people not to upload data sets that already exist elsewhere. Right now, we're not able to share data that are subject to GDPR. We're working on trying to figure that out, but that's a challenge. So once you've done that, the data set gets uploaded, and we have this web uploader. There's also a command line uploader for bigger data sets. And finally, you've got your data set. You've got your page here, and you can see all the information. You've got your DOI that you can put into your paper, and people can come and download it once you've made it public. So the current status is, so we're one of the official repositories for the NIH Brain Initiative, funded for the next 3 years. As I mentioned, we're part of the Amazon Public Datasets project. We have about 16 terabytes of data right now, though data sets are getting a lot bigger, so that's growing quickly. We get about 10 to 20 new data sets a month, and we're serving about 1,000 downloads, about 20 terabytes of download a month, about 7,000 users a month. And this is just showing the usage since we launched the site in June 2017. The usage has gone up pretty substantially. So what's happening in the future? We'll soon have more data types like PET. We're working with others to try to integrate. So that, for example, you can visualize the data. We're working with Scott McKaig's group to do that, integrating with other analysis platforms. You're going to hear later from Mark Musin about his CEDAR project, and we're working to try to integrate with them to provide better metadata support. And then finally, our search tool right now isn't very good, so we're trying to come up with better ways to search the data. So I want to end by just saying a couple things about some of the lessons that we've learned from data sharing within the neuroimaging field, because I think it's been, we're not the only data sharing project. There's a number of others out there as well. I think in general, data sharing has been remarkably successful in our field. And I think the first thing I would say is that, in general, data sharing needs a scientific rationale. I mean, the goals of transparency and openness are great, but they're not enough to get most people to share data because it's work, right? It's extra work to have to format and share your data. So, what we saw in the neuroimaging field was that people were able to ask scientific questions when they started combining shared data sets that they could never answer based on a single data set. And that really got more people to start sharing. The community buy-in is essential. And we saw this in the neuroimaging field. People started trying to share data about 20 years ago, this thing called the fMRI data center. And there was a big backlash because the community just wasn't ready. And so, many of us have spent the last basically 10 years trying to advocate for data sharing in neuroimaging. And I think it's important that, whoever's pushing data sharing isn't somebody from outside of the field, but they're really bona fide members of the community. And, as we say in Silicon Valley, that they eat their own dog food, that they're doing the things that they're telling others to do. Another, thing that we've tried to do is keep it simple and keep it as close to standard practice as possible. So in the past, there've been a number of solutions that were like really heavily over-engineered. I'm showing you an example of one on the side. And, I like to say if there's more than 2 acronyms involved, then, it's probably going to be hard for people to get their head around it. And so you want to really kind of make sure that it's not a huge lift for people to move from what they're already doing into what they need to do to share. And finally, and I think this is, worth saying about open science in general, right, is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Doing something is better than doing nothing. And in our case, we've tried to put effort into the things that are going to work for most people. There's always going to be a long tail of edge cases, and there's always going to be a bunch of people who think that unless you haven't dealt with every edge case that, what you're doing is useless. But, we've tried not to let those edge cases derail us from addressing the common and highest value use cases. Okay, so finally, I just want to thank all the people who worked on this project, particularly Chris Gorylewski, who, helped start it, and these others and people who've given us money. And I will stop now and stop sharing my slides, and happy to have some discussion.
Okay.
Thanks, Russ. All right, Maryam, go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to go through the questions. There's some good questions here, and then maybe I would jump in with my own questions too. The first question is, I'm sure many of us are not actually in charge of our data set. It's a good question. If you're part of a project that are in a larger umbrella, such as under a PI or BOSS, what are good ways to discuss data sharing with those who are in charge of these decisions, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, it's clear to me, having talked about this stuff a lot in the last few years, it's clear to me that, early career researchers are much more enthusiastic about this, and in general, are mostly very enthusiastic. More senior people who are PIs are, I think more mixed in their support for data sharing. So I think that, I can imagine a few different strategies. And, some of them are about like the benefits of data sharing. So showing, for example, when we at Stanford just recently put out an ad for a faculty position, we said it explicitly in the ad, we would like you to document any open science practices that are reproducible. I think we framed it open science or reproducibility related practices. I can't remember exactly what we said, but basically we want to know, when you're applying for our position, what are you doing to make your science as open as possible? And so highlighting those kinds of things, I think, is useful because it'll really, suggest to your PI that, if they say no to sharing the data, that they could actually be, hurting your career. Now, I think the other thing to say is, is I can imagine another reason that they would not be enthusiastic is that it's extra work. And I think I noticed another comment or question, or maybe it was in the poll where somebody said something about how, sharing data is a lot of work. And part of the goal of, things like bids is basically to make it as little work as possible, right? So the idea is that if you use the standard up front, if you just sort of naturally organize your data according to the standard, then it's very little extra work. Basically it's going to Open Neuro and clicking a button or clicking a few buttons to upload the data. And so, obviously that still takes some work to retool things up front. But another important thing to keep in mind is even if you never share the data with the rest of the world, many people want to go back later and reanalyze their own data. And looking at your data 6 months later, if you haven't thought about them for a long time, unless they're well organized and documented, you're not going to know what you're looking at, right? Often. And so you can think of like sharing the data not just as helping the rest of the world, but also helping your future self, right? When you want to reuse those data later, it makes it really easy for you to do that. I'll also point out, one other thing about bids. When we came up with bids, we wanted to figure out how can we incentivize people to use it. And so one thing we did was coordinate building a bunch of applications. We call them bids apps, which are basically containerized applications such that if your data are in the bids format, it makes it really easy to apply processing tools. So for example, if you want to run FreeSurfer on your data, without the bids app, you have to go reorganize your data so that it looks exactly like what FreeSurfer wants it to look like. If you have a bids data set, you just point the FreeSurfer bids app at your data, and it knows the structure of a bids data set and will find what it needs and run on it. So that also, at least in thinking about making the move towards bids or, whatever the relevant standard would be, if those tools are available, that's another incentive.
Yeah, I want to also add a little bit to that any change of practice in any organization, any human construct requires a little bit of advocacy. So if you think that data sharing is good, you think that your university or organization is not implementing it, you should start advocating for it. Invite people who know about it, invite people who have done it, and organize conferences or mini meetings that would introduce the concept to your organization and start so that people start implementing it where you are, basically. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question, which is actually also a good question. It's actually kind of a standards are wonderful for making it simple to share data, but they are also making it harder to innovate when it comes to new forms of data. Does BID get in the way of things like that?
I don't know that I think BIDS is flexible enough that it's certainly, the goal is not to constrain what people do, right? The goal is to provide people with a way to describe the data. But, there are certainly going to be cases that are challenging to deal with. And in part, that's the goal of the extension process. So in the short term, it could potentially, for a new type of data, make it challenging to share those data. But if you work with the BIDS community on an extension proposal, which has now been done for lots of different types of data, that's our way of kind of dealing with this problem. So I think it certainly requires some work, and it can get in the way in the short term. But the hope is that we provide a way for anybody who wants to share their data in BIDS to ultimately be able to do that.
Can I actually ask a question that is somewhat related to this? In the pipeline of analysis, we use a lot of software, and they have their own standards of formatting things and putting things in folders and stuff like that. And BIDS has its own format. How much actually for people to realize how much work it is, we need to kind of know how much work has been done for BIDS to be integrated with different softwares, AFNI, FreeSurfer, so on and so forth. I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit, maybe expand a little bit on it so that people kind of know exactly how much extra work it is to start using BIDS.
Yeah. In part, it's going to depend on how far the existing standard is from BIDS and, what level of skill one has in kind of developing, basically the idea is you can either rewrite your code to use BIDS directly, and there are tools. For example, there's a Python package called PyBids that basically can read in a BIDS data set and query it and give you lots of information. There's ongoing work to try to, for example, provide MATLAB interfaces. But it's still, that's, one way to deal with it is to rewrite the code. The other is to build some kind of, sort of shim or interface between what your code wants and what a BIDS data set looks like. And that's what the BIDS apps do, for example, for FreeSurfer. It's not a trivial amount of work because, the FreeSurfer structure is pretty different from BIDS. But that code is all available online. So if one wanted to go go to the BIDS apps GitHub page and look at the FreeServe for BIDS app, you can actually see, and I didn't write that one, so I don't know all the things that went into it, but you can see all the things that would have gone into doing that, and kind of that could give one a feel for exactly how, kind of complicated that's going to be.
Okay. This is like, again, a kind of a technical question. How does BIDS store stimulus information?
The short answer is, I guess there's two ways to answer that. One is that it doesn't necessarily, in the sense that it doesn't require you to put in stimulus information. The other thing to say is that, the metadata standard is pretty flexible. So for every imaging, for every like functional imaging file, there's a file that goes along with that called an events file, and that basically is just a tab delimited text file. You can put whatever you wanted to. So for example, if you had the name, you had stimulus information for each event that happened, you could put that into that text file. Now there's ongoing work by Scott McCaig's group and others to develop, this is coming out of the EEG world, but I think it'll be useful for lots of different types of imaging, develop these things called head tags, hierarchical event descriptor tags, which provide a more formal way to actually tag stimulus information in relation to different events that happen. But basically the short answer is, I think if whatever you want to store, you would just put it into that events file along with each event.
Again, a technical question. It says, we learned about NWB, I think it's the Neurodata Without Borders earlier. Is the general structure similar between NWB and BIDS?
I haven't actually worked directly with NWB, so I know about it very, very broadly. So I can't actually say the degree to which their file structure looks similar to our file structure. We have similar goals for sure. But because a long time ago, we talked with them about, potentially trying to work together, and it just didn't, it wasn't clear that our use cases were similar enough to try to kind of integrate. Having said that, people are certainly we have for BIDS, we have a standard for intracranial EEG, and obviously that's starting to look very much like the electrophysiological data that, that NWB works for. So I think that, the kind of which standard you use is really best determined by, the standard that other people in your particular research field are using. So, the other labs that you're closest with, or whose work is most similar to yours, whatever standard they're using should be the one that you use, because that's going to make it easiest whatever the tools kind of enable using, because that's going to make it easiest for the people in your kind of research area to move back and forth.
Okay, the next question is, I don't think it's related to this panel, so I'm going to skip that. If the pushback to contributing lab data is concerned with being scooped, that's a good question. What is a persuasive response to that concern? I like that question, actually.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I'm glad somebody asked it. And there's a few ways to go with it. One of them, so this guy Gary King from Harvard, he's a political scientist, but does a lot of data science work. He has a great quote, which is something like, you shouldn't worry about being scooped. You should worry about being ignored, right? That the most important thing is for people to know who you are and what you're doing, right? I will also say, I've been sharing data openly for almost 10 years now, and I've never been scooped on those data, and often, we've gone back and done things with them years later, and have never really felt like that's a problem. I know of one person who has a credible claim to having been scooped, where by scoop that means, they put a data set online, and then some number of years later, somebody took those data set and did an analysis that they had hoped to do with them. In general, I've seen a lot of people share data, and I know of that one example at least in brain imaging or in neuroscience of someone's work being scooped. Whereas on the other hand, I think that if you're putting data out people are going to know who you are. And we, for example, at Open Neuro, we have a little leaderboard, where whoever has shared the most data in the last few months, gets sort of highlighted in our newsletter. And so there's, sharing data makes you evident as a researcher. And so that's my, and obviously some people are going to remain to be concerned about being scooped. I mean, I think that, in general, with data that are as complex as ours, I think that the concern about being scooped is kind of, there's always going to be something one can do with data. Now, it may be that you can't get, the first paper showing some particular thing and thus can't get the paper in the glossy magazine. I think, that's a whole other discussion to be had about, why we think papers in glossy magazines are so important as markers of scientific quality. But I think that, I've never seen somebody not be able to publish a data set because someone else took it and did something with it that they wanted to do. In my lab, at least.
Yeah, we have someone who posted a question in the list, and I think they want to come on stage. So I'm going to read the next question, but maybe we should bring them up afterwards. Someone asked, I wonder if you can share some success stories from data sharing practices. Have there been cases where new collaboration arose or major mistakes were caught and corrected? I think you talked about a couple of mistake situations, but maybe a positive side of it would be, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll talk about one kind of success story, which is a postdoc in my lab, Max Shine, who's now a faculty member in Australia. Max spent a couple of years in my lab and got a number of papers in, pretty high profile places, I think pretty cool papers, all using shared data, right? And one of those papers, several of them were using openly shared data. One was using data where, we got in touch with a couple of different research groups after they published, they published findings on studies that were, where we thought we could do something interesting with those data using a new analysis approach. We, ended up having them as collaborators on the paper, and that sort of worked out really well. So this, it's worked in various ways, both in terms of a researcher who didn't have the ability to collect new data because we didn't have funding to collect new data. He nonetheless was able to publish a number of papers using data that are either shared publicly or privately. Major mistakes caught and corrected. So I'll mention a recent thing where there's an interesting twist here. So you might be familiar with the ABCD study, which is this large study of brain development. We recently put out a preprint that showed that we were able to get their raw data and actually show that they had made a number of mistakes in the design of one of the tasks that could potentially make it more difficult to analyze those data. And so had those data not been made publicly and people were just publishing on the basis of them internally, or if just the summary data were made available and not the raw data, one would not have been able to find those things. Now, interestingly, we put all of our code online, and another group recently went through our code with a very fine-grained comb and actually found a mistake that we had made that didn't change the overall conclusion, but it changed the potential impact, kind of lessen the potential impact of one of the problems a little bit. So that's been a case where I think both data sharing and code sharing have been helpful in both unearthing potential problems and helping to correct things before, this is they found this based on our preprint and our code that, that was out prior to publication. Right? So, and that otherwise we would have published that paper with an incorrect number in it.
But I wonder if that actually, it's a double-edged sword. So finding mistakes could be incentive for the scientific community, but also for people who want to share data, the fear of maybe they have mistakes that could be found out actually could work against sort of sharing data in a way. So
yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think part of what we need to do is change, how we think about errors, right? I wrote a couple blog posts about this a while back, and that's in part why I, always try to highlight the fact that, whenever I make an error, whenever we have errors, because everybody makes errors, right? Professional software developers make errors, so a bunch of scientists are necessarily going to be making errors whenever they're writing code, and I think that what we've seen is when people make errors, what really determines what happens is how they respond to it. So there was a case of a few years ago, a guy who was a structural biologist had to retract 3 science papers and a couple of other papers because of a software error in their analyses. And he responded well, and they went on, and and he's gone on to have a perfectly good career. And I don't think it really cost him that much in the long run. But obviously nobody wants to, the idea of having an error unearthed is really unsettling to people. But I think that the question is, would you rather publish a paper that has an error in it and have that go undetected, or would you rather have somebody find it? And especially, the nice thing about publishing a preprint and putting the code out with the preprint is that it gives people a chance to find things before they actually end up in publication.
okay, we have Tara on stage. Tara?
Hi.
Hello there. Hey, I wanted to ask something that's actually pivoting away a little bit from the bit standard, and it's more related to your new publication with Rotem as first author. And it's maybe a little bit controversial, but I have to put out a disclaimer so that I'm not an fMRI person myself, so this is more hearsay. But I think a lot of people have a little bit of a feeling like, this is something that's actually, we kind of already knew, that if people look at the same data with different processing pipelines, etc., that maybe their interpretations will lead to something different, especially when the topic is based on a pretty complicated task. Like, why didn't you look at I don't know, topography in V1 or something like that, where that if you don't get the gold standard there, then we're really screwed. But I think what is maybe a little bit dangerous in this case is that especially people that maybe have a less thorough understanding might take away from it that fMRI is like a nonsense field in that sense. And I was wondering, what do you say to people that take that away from the study? And to put it in its most controversial way, do you think this is a disservice to the field?
I don't think it's a disservice to the field. I think that it's, it is what it is, right? Oh, sorry. So somebody's asking me to summarize the paper. So the short story is we collected a data set on a relatively complex decision-making task. Part of it was kind of a replication of something we had done a few years ago. And we gave the data set out to a bunch of teams. We gave it out to 80-something teams and gave them several months to basically analyze the data, just telling them, analyze it the way that you would normally in your own lab, and give us back answers on 9 hypotheses. Like, is there activation for this particular aspect of the task in this particular part of the brain? But again, defining those things, pretty much however you would usually define them. And the result was that, across the 70 teams, if you look at those 9 yes/no answers, there were 33 different patterns of yes/no answers, right? And several of the hypotheses, pretty much everybody agreed that there wasn't anything going on. One of them, pretty much everybody agreed, yes, there's activation. And then the other 5 were basically somewhere in the middle, where 20 to 40% of the teams were saying, yes, there's activation. This is for exactly the same data, right? And part of this was, that there were some errors made in how the models were specified. But even for people who did the models correctly and, whose underlying data actually looked really similar, when you do the statistical thresholding, you come up with answers that turned out to be different. I think that's important to know. I think not knowing that and continuing going on and telling people to publish in the way they've been publishing, that would be a disservice to the field, right? I also don't think there's anything special about fMRI here. I think that if you went to any other field where, where there's really complex data, large data, complex analyses, either in neuroscience or elsewhere, I would put money on one finding very similar types of variability in the results. And so I agree that there probably are things we should have done differently. We probably should have had, well, I mean, it would have been great if we had actually used simulated data where we knew what the answer should be. But we wanted to do it in a way that didn't seem like a canned project. We wanted it to be, we wanted there to be some uncertainty. I wish we would have included some kind of contrast where, like, is there activity in motor cortex when people press a button, where we would have known the ground truth, or at least been close to the ground truth. I think you're right that that's one of the missing things, because everybody would have found that for sure, right? But I don't know if that addresses your question, or if you want to bring up other issues.
No, I think that was a good, yeah. I think mainly the part, because I agree that it's good to show that, and I think I appreciate your answer with regards to things that we would know that's all 70 teams probably would agree on. So I think that's a good clarification.
Right, and thanks. And so I should just add,
that's the paper, by the way, that I just finished.
Oh, cool. When we did a meta-analysis across all the 70 teams' results, we did find things were consistent, right? And so one of the things this leads us to think is that we really should focus in the future on not just analyzing a data set in one way, but actually analyzing a data set in many ways and asking, what's consistent across those many different analyses.
Yeah, one of the things that I also really liked about the paper was this marketplace type of thing. So if I remember that correctly, you asked researchers to kind of give a weighting to how well their own hypothesis fits to
yeah, so let me just describe it briefly. So we use what's called a prediction market, which is something that economists do. And we basically gave people money and had them sort of invest in the different hypotheses. But the goal is to have them really, tell us what their true preferences are. One set of people who did it basically hadn't seen the data. They were people from the kind of neuroeconomics field who would know about these experiments, but didn't know anything about the data. Another market was run with people who knew about the data. And the really striking thing that comes out of both of those is that especially people who didn't know anything about the data, but even the people who knew about the data over predicted the likelihood of activation, right? So, on the hypotheses where 20% of the teams were actually showing activation, the predictions were that more than 50%, like 60 or 70%, would actually be finding activation. So, fMRI is kind of, Colin Kammerer has this great quote, fMRI isn't so much oversold as overbought, right? That everybody thought we were going to kind of find something for all of these when in fact it was less common than that.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool too.
Thank you, Tara.
You're welcome.
I have a sort of a question that is related to the pipeline, but I want you to answer it in two different ways, Russ. So we design experiments, collect data, analyze data, and then publish. In this pipeline, when this data sharing happens and should happen, basically, when you collect the data, when you have already published one study with it, and then you want to share the data, or when you have several publications and then you want to share the data. And I want you to answer it in two different ways. How would you do it now, and how do you want it to be done in an ideal scientific utopia, basically? The answer might be the same or different. I don't know.
Yeah. How we're doing it now is generally, for imaging studies, we would generally share the data when we submit the paper or when we put out the preprint, right? Because we generally would like to be able to point to the data set in the paper and say that, hey, it's available. And I think that's, as kind of like a utopian practice, I think that's actually not terrible. I mean, you could imagine having this kind of really prospective data sharing where every time you collect a new data set, it goes out. I think that the problem there is that, you can have people kind of taking the data and doing stuff with it when it's not a complete data set and coming up with, for example, doing underpowered analyses, and then making conclusions on the basis of those. I think that's probably not optimal. So I don't have a problem with, kind of keeping the data private until one, posts a preprint and submits a paper.
Mm-hmm. And one last question, and I think this is something, and Brad, I think we can wrap it up after, is I think it's kind of related to this, and that's something that a lot of people are concerned about when it comes to data sharing, and that's credit assignment. I've spent a lot of time, collected this data, now I put it out there, other people are using the fruits, just citing me, my name doesn't appear on the paper. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a really challenging question. And, particular for people like, I've had this conversation with people who do monkey neurophysiology, right? Who they spend like a year training one animal. And then, they're like, you expect me to put my data out so that anybody else could, just take them and do stuff with them. And I totally, especially for like really difficult to acquire data sets, I totally understand that challenge. And so I think it's reasonable to say, it's not reasonable to say I'm not going to share the data. I think it's reasonable to say, I'm happy to share these data under a particular use agreement, and it may be that that you think that that use agreement should involve you being a co-author on their papers, right? I think that's I think that there are cases where that's probably a reasonable thing to do. In general, I don't like the idea of putting kind of authorship requirements on shared data, mostly just because it really slows things down, and it also can it can inhibit some of the uses of data that where somebody may not want to include someone else as a co-author. But I think that I don't have a problem with that, especially in cases where it's really clear that the data were just so hard to collect.
Okay, Brad. Anything else? You're done?
Yeah, no, I think that's it. Thank you, Russ. That was absolutely wonderful.
This was great.
It was so great to learn about this. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks very much.
I mean, I do EEG work, and I'm looking forward to getting into bids for some of our data sets as well. So,
Okay.
Cool. All right. Thanks everybody.
Russ. Yep.
Oh,
now, everyone.
cool. Thanks. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Oh, and yeah, completely forgot to pour.
So coming up next is a session that you will shortly be pulled into on open science. There you go. You should be pulled.